Part 1. Snow over Copper Creek. The wind came first, a low moan across the vast, unforgiving Wyoming plains that promised nothing but trouble. Then came the snow, not the gentle flakes of a Christmas card, but a hard, horizontal blizzard that scoured the land and erased the trail. By the time the weary wagon of preacher Nathan Harper and his daughter Eliza rattled into the nascent town of Copper Creek, in November of 1883, the world had been reduced to a maelstrom of white and a cold so profound it felt like a physical blow. Eliza, 18 and shaped by a quiet life of scripture and duty, huddled deeper into her woolen shawl, its threads thin from too many winters. The fabric, once a cheerful blue, was now the color of a faded sky, much like the hope they'd carried west. Drought had withered their small farm in Nebraska, and debt, a far more relentless force than any locust swarm, had chased them here. Copper Creek was meant to be a new beginning, a place where a man of God could build a congregation and a daughter could help him rebuild a life. But looking at the few huddled buildings, their outlines blurred by the storm, it felt more like an end. "We're here, Eliza girl," her father said, his voice raw from the wind. Nathan Harper was a tall, stooped man, his face a roadmap of faith and hardship. The lines around his eyes spoke of kindness, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed a worry that prayer alone could not soothe. The town's only boarding house, run by a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Quinn, offered a room that was little more than a closet with 2 cots, but the pot-bellied stove in the common area radiated a heat that felt like salvation. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, bacon grease, and stale coffee. As her father paid Mrs. Quinn with a pained reluctance, handing over coins that were meant to last them weeks, Eliza felt the familiar sting of shame. Poverty was a constant, unwelcome companion. Later, sent to fetch a bucket of water from the well out back, Eliza hugged the wall of the building, seeking shelter from the wind's relentless assault. The saloon next door spilled a rectangle of yellow light onto the churning snow, and, through the noise, she saw 2 men step into the relative quiet of the alley. One was Deputy Jeb Crowley, a man whose guts strained the buttons of his uniform and whose eyes seemed to constantly scan for advantage. The other was taller, dressed in a fine city coat that looked out of place against the town's rough-hewn timber. He had a face like a hawk and an air of cold authority. This, she would later learn, was Silas Blackthorne. Eliza pressed herself into the shadows, not wanting to be seen. She wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but the wind carried their words in sharp, clear fragments. "The last shipment is in the warehouse," Blackthorne said, his voice a low rumble. "The preacher is the perfect cover. No one suspects a man of God." Crowley grunted. "He'll serve his purpose." Blackthorne passed a heavy leather pouch to the deputy. It clinked softly. "See that he does. The railroad needs this land clear, and the townsfolk need a lesson in cooperation." As Crowley took the bag, his glove slipped. In the dim light, Eliza saw it clearly. The pouch was smudged with a fine, black dust, dark and greasy like coal. The deputy quickly pocketed it. The 2 men exchanged a curt nod, and then they were gone, swallowed by the storm. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. She filled her bucket, the icy water sloshing over the rim, and hurried back inside. The image of the coal-dusted pouch burned into her mind. That night, the blizzard howled like a hungry wolf. The raid came just before dawn. Shouts erupted from the street, followed by the splintering of wood, peering through a small clearing she'd rubbed on the frosted window pane. Eliza saw them, a handful of riders, their faces obscured by scarves, storming the general store's warehouse, the Copper Creek boys. She'd heard them whispered about, phantoms who struck and vanished. The chaos was swift and brutal. They were gone in minutes, leaving behind a shattered door and trampled snow. The knock on their own door was a thunderous blow that shook the small room. Deputy Crowley filled the doorway, 2 burly men behind him. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Nathan Harper," he boomed, his eyes sweeping the room with manufactured authority. "You're under arrest." "Arrest?" Nathan stammered, rising from his cot. "On what charge?" "Aiding and abetting the robbery of the general store. We have a witness says you gave the layout to the Copper Creek boys." It was a lie, as stark and ugly as the raw timber walls around them. Eliza flew to her father's side. "No, he's done nothing. We only just arrived." Crowley sneered, his gaze lingering on Eliza for a moment too long. "That's what they all say. Newcomers bring trouble." He nodded to his men. They seized her father, whose look of bewildered protest was all the defense he could muster. They dragged him out into the pre-dawn gloom, leaving Eliza standing alone, her world collapsing around her. Her pleas for help were met with slammed doors and suspicious glares. The good people of Copper Creek, cowed by the storm and the brazen outlaws, wanted nothing to do with the preacher's daughter. Fear was a currency Blackthorne and Crowley spent freely, and the townsfolk were bankrupt of courage. Defeated, Eliza huddled in the common room of the boarding house, the fire in the stove offering no warmth against the ice in her soul. It was then that a quiet voice cut through her despair. "They will not help you." Eliza looked up into the dark, knowing eyes of an older woman. Her face was a beautiful tapestry of wrinkles, her hair a streak of silver braided down her back. She had been a silent presence in the corner, mending a saddle blanket. It was Doña Rosa, the housekeeper from the big ranch north of town. "The law in this town belongs to Silas Blackthorne," the woman continued, her voice soft but firm. "But there is one man who does not bend to him. Ethan McCrae." McCrae. Eliza whispered the name. "He owns the Triple R Ranch. He is a hard man, a quiet man, but he is a just man." Doña Rosa gave her directions: a perilous journey on a clear day, a fool's errand in this blizzard. Go to him, tell him what you saw. Tell him Doña Rosa sent you. Hope, fragile as a spring blossom, flickered in Eliza's chest, clutching her thin shawl. She slipped out of the boarding house and into the white fury of the storm. The prairie was a sea of churning snow. The wind tore at her shawl and whipped her hair across her face, the icy strands stinging her cheeks like lashes. Every step was a battle. The cold seeped through her worn boots, turning her feet into blocks of unfeeling ice. She stumbled, fell, and pushed herself back up. Her father's face her only guide. Wolves howled in the distance, their calls a lonely, terrifying harmony with the wind. The world was a blur of white, and soon she couldn't tell if the roaring was in her ears or in the sky. Just as the last of her strength gave out, a faint, yellow light appeared in the distance. A lantern, a house. She fixed her eyes on it, a desperate beacon in the endless storm. She didn't remember the last 100 yards, only the splintery feel of a porch beneath her frozen hands as she collapsed. The door creaked open, spilling warm light onto the snow. A figure loomed over her, a silhouette against the lamp's glow. He was large, broad-shouldered, and moved with a quiet economy that spoke of immense strength. He knelt, and for a moment, Eliza saw his face weathered, his jaw set, with eyes the color of a winter sky, shadowed by things she couldn't guess. Then the world went black. She awoke in pieces. First, the warmth. A heavy wool blanket was tucked around her, and a fire crackled in a great stone hearth nearby. Then came the smells: wood smoke, strong coffee, leather, and something antiseptic. Finally, the pain, a sharp, rhythmic sting in her left shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open. She was on a simple cot in a large, sparsely furnished room. The man from the porch was sitting in a chair beside her, his attention focused on her shoulder. In his large, calloused hands, he held a needle and thread, his movements surprisingly deft as he stitched a nasty gash she hadn't even known she had. He glanced up and saw she was awake. His expression didn't change. "You took a bad fall. Caught a branch, I reckon. Lie still." His voice was a low baritone, rough like gravel but steady. Shame washed over her, hot and immediate. A stranger, a man, and he was tending to her, seeing her in her patched dress, her vulnerability laid bare. She tried to sit up, a protest forming on her lips, but a wave of dizziness pushed her back down. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She hated this, hated being a burden, owing a debt she could never repay. He finished his work, tying off the thread with a neat knot. "Don't thank me yet," he said, his gaze distant. "Shelterin' folks ain't always brought me good fortune." He stood and walked to the fireplace, resting a hand on the mantel. His fingers brushed against an old pocket watch, its silver casing dented and its glass face cracked clean across. He stared into the flames, his back to her, a fortress of solitude. Eliza saw the tension in his shoulders and knew, with a certainty that startled her, that this man was wrestling with ghosts of his own. This was Ethan McCrae, and she had brought her trouble right to his doorstep. The storm raged for another day, while Eliza rested, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. She was aware of Doña Rosa moving about the house, her presence a quiet comfort. McCrae kept his distance, but he was always there, a watchful sentinel. When the blizzard finally broke, the world outside was a pristine, silent expanse of white. The sun on the snow was blinding. Ethan pulled on a heavy sheepskin coat and went out to check on his stock. As he rode toward his main gate, he saw it. Nailed to the heavy timber post was a piece of paper, the ink already starting to run. It was a crudely lettered notice of foreclosure, citing unpaid taxes and land survey disputes. It was signed with a flourish by Deputy Jeb Crowley. Ethan tore the notice from the post, his jaw tightening. It was a fraud, and he knew it. This was not the law. This was a threat. A warning shot from Silas Blackthorne, delivered by his puppet. He crumpled the paper in his fist, the sound lost in the immense silence of the snow-covered land. He looked back toward the house, where the preacher's daughter lay wounded and afraid. Her trouble, he realized with a grim finality, was now his. Part 2. The Girl Who Walked In on the Rich Cowboy. The days that followed the blizzard were unnervingly still. The world was draped in a blanket of white so thick it muffled all sound, creating a profound silence broken only by the crunch of boots on snow or the distant lowing of cattle. For Eliza, the silence was a space to be filled with anxieties. Her father was in a cold cell. Her future was a terrifying blank. And she was a guest at charity case in the home of a man who was a complete stranger. She was determined not to be idle. She rose before the sun, her shoulder a dull throb, and sought out tasks, needing the rhythm of work to quiet the frantic beating of her own heart. It was on the third morning that the incident occurred. Doña Rosa had tasked her with bringing a kettle of hot water to the small washroom adjacent to the main living area, a rustic enclosure built of rough-hewn pine. Ethan, the woman had mentioned, liked to wash away the chill of the morning chores before breakfast. Eliza moved quietly, her borrowed moccasins making no sound on the wooden floorboards. The kettle was heavy, and steam billowed from its spout, warming her face. As she approached the washroom, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, a draft, perhaps, from a chink in the walls. She assumed the room was empty. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, her hands occupied with the kettle. "I've brought the words died in her throat. The room was a cloud of steam, thick and swirling in the cold morning air. Through the haze, she saw him, a silhouette, the broad, powerful shape of Ethan McCrae's shoulders and back, the muscles clearly defined as he stood over a large wooden basin. Water glistened on his skin in the dim light filtering through a small, high window. Time stopped. The world narrowed to the sight of this man, unguarded and unaware. It wasn't a moment of lust, but of profound, shocking intimacy. She saw not just a rancher, but a man marked by life. A faint tracery of old scars crisscrossed his back, pale lines against his tanned skin, telling stories she couldn't begin to imagine. Her heart, which had been a nervous flutter, gave a single, powerful thud against her ribs, so loud she was sure he must have heard it. A gasp escaped her lips, a small, involuntary sound. He froze, then turned in a swift, fluid motion. He was quicker than a man his size had any right to be. He had a towel in his hand, and he held it up instantly, shielding himself, but not before their eyes met. His were wide with surprise, not anger. In that fleeting second, she saw a flash of vulnerability in them that mirrored her own. A wave of heat, more intense than any steam, flooded Eliza's cheeks. She felt her entire body flush with a mortifying blush. She stood rooted to the spot, the heavy kettle suddenly feeling as if it were made of lead. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice low and steady, though a shade huskier than usual. "If you'd wait outside." The quiet command broke her paralysis. She stammered an apology, a jumble of words that made no sense, and backed out of the room. Pulling the door firmly shut, she leaned against the wall, her eyes squeezed tight. The image of him seared into her mind. The kettle trembled in her hands. A moment later, the door opened again. He was wearing trousers and was in the middle of buttoning a clean shirt. His hair was damp, and he avoided her gaze, focusing on a spot on the far wall. "My apologies, Miss Harper," he said, his ears visibly red. "The latch on that door is loose. I should have warned you." "No, it was my fault," she whispered, her own eyes fixed on the floorboards. "I should have knocked. I am so sorry." The air between them crackled with an awkwardness so thick it was almost tangible. But beneath it, something had shifted. The formal barrier between the stoic rancher and the frightened preacher's daughter had been breached. In that shared moment of embarrassment, they were just a man and a woman, their mutual respect for the unspoken boundary, a silent testament to their character. The incident, as mortifying as it was, became a strange sort of bridge. Later that morning, sitting at the long kitchen table while Doña Rosa kneaded dough, the silence was no longer one of distance, but of contemplation. It was Ethan who broke it. "You never told me why your father was arrested," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. Taking a deep breath, Eliza finally let it all pour out. She told him about their journey, the debt, and her father's hope for a new life in Copper Creek. Then, her voice dropping to a near whisper, she recounted what she had witnessed in the alley: Silas Blackthorne, Deputy Crowley, and the leather pouch smudged with coal dust. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. He steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on the cracked pocket watch he'd placed on the table. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Blackthorne works for the railroad," he said finally. "They want this land, all of it. They've been buying out or pushing out the smaller homesteaders for a year now. The coal dust. There's a new mine opening up in the foothills. It all connects." He looked directly at her, his winter sky eyes clear and serious. "Your father didn't just stumble into trouble, Miss Harper. He was chosen, a perfect scapegoat to create chaos and fear. He promised he would ride to the next county to speak with a lawyer he trusted, an honest man who owed him a favor. He also said he would ask Dr. May Calloway, the town's physician, to formally examine her father. May's seen more of this town's underbelly than anyone. He said, her word carries weight." A fragile sense of hope began to push through Eliza's despair, but it was entangled with a fierce, burning need for self-reliance. She would not be a damsel waiting for rescue. The next days established a new routine under Doña Rosa's tutelage. Eliza learned the rhythms of a ranch house, her hands growing calloused from scrubbing floors and mending clothes. She found a friend in Tommy Pike, a scrawny 12-year-old orphan who worked as a stable hand. He was a boy with an old soul and an unshakable loyalty to Ethan. He taught her how to properly brush down a horse and saddle it, his young face a mask of concentration as he explained the intricacies of the knots. One afternoon, Ethan found her in the corral, struggling to heave a heavy saddle onto a patient mare. He watched her for a moment, then walked over, taking it from her and settling it into place with one effortless motion. "If you're going to live out here," he said, his voice flat, "you need to know more than how to saddle a horse. You need to know how to protect yourself." He led her to a clearing behind the barn, a Colt revolver in his hand. The gun was heavy, cold, and felt alien in her grasp. Her father had taught her that such things were instruments of violence, tools of the devil. But out here, she was beginning to understand. They were simply tools of survival. His hands covered hers, adjusting her grip. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the gun. He stood behind her, his chest a solid wall at her back, his voice a low murmur in her ear as he explained how to aim, how to control her breathing. "Don't think about who or what you're aiming at," he instructed. "Just focus on the sight. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." The first shot was a deafening explosion that made her flinch, the recoil jarring her arm. The bullet went wide, kicking up a puff of dirt 10 feet from the tin can he'd set on a fence post. But she didn't give up. With his quiet guidance, she shot again, and again. By the end of the afternoon, she was hitting the can more often than not. As she handed the revolver back to him, their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting contact, but it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, approval, perhaps, or something deeper she didn't dare to name. The news came with Tommy, who had ridden into town for supplies. His face was grim as he dismounted. "Mr. McCrae," he said, his voice tight. "Word's all over town. Blackthorn's posted notices. He's holding a public auction in 2 weeks, selling off all the foreclosed properties, including the Harper's claim." The ticking clock had just gotten louder. That evening, Ethan sat by the fire, the fraudulent notice he'd torn from his gatepost spread on the table before him. He studied it under the lamplight, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Eliza watched him, the way the firelight carved shadows on his rugged face. An attraction, unwanted and unnerving, was taking root in her heart. She fought it, reminding herself of her place, of the debt she owed him. He was her protector, nothing more. To think otherwise was a folly she couldn't afford. Suddenly, Ethan let out a low grunt. He picked up a magnifying glass from a nearby desk and leaned closer to the notice. "What is it?" Eliza asked. "The county seal," he said, tracing it with his finger. He walked over to a locked wooden chest and retrieved an old land deed, an official document from years ago. He laid them side by side. "Look." At first, she saw nothing. But under the glass, the difference was clear. On the official deed, the eagle in the center of the seal had a sharply defined talon. On the foreclosure notice, the same talon was slightly blurred, the impression less distinct. "It's a forgery," Ethan breathed, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "A good one, but not perfect. They have a man inside the county clerk's office, someone with access to the press, but not the official die." It was their first solid piece of evidence, a key that could unlock the entire conspiracy. Ethan stood up. His decision made, the quiet, solitary rancher was gone. In his place stood the man he used to be, the Army scout, the strategist. "We're going to town tomorrow. Miss Harper," he announced. "It's time to stop hiding. I'm posting your father's bond and officially standing as his guarantor. Let's see how Crowley and Blackthorn like having their business conducted in the open." He was drawing a line in the sand, publicly declaring himself an enemy of the most powerful men in the territory. He was doing it for her father. And as Eliza looked at him, standing tall in the firelight, her heart beat a steady, resolute rhythm. It was no longer just a heart awakened by a chance encounter. It was the heart of a woman who had found something worth fighting for. At Part 3, Dust and Oaths, the decision to publicly challenge Silas Blackthorne transformed the atmosphere at the R. The quiet sanctuary of the ranch house became a headquarters for a silent, two-person war. The morning after Ethan declared his intentions, they rode out, not towards the town and its corrupt deputy, but towards the skeletal frame of the old wooden bridge on the edge of Blackthorne's ever-expanding railroad territory. The pristine snow had begun to melt under a grudging sun, revealing a landscape of mud and dormant grass. "If you saw coal dust on the pouch," Ethan said, his eyes scanning the ground as they rode. "It came from a heavy wagon, not a saddlebag." Eliza, mounted on the gentle mare Tommy had saddled for her, nodded. The cold air was sharp in her lungs. The easy, powerful way Ethan sat his horse was a stark contrast to her own tense posture. She was a preacher's daughter, used to pews and prayer books. Yet here she was, tracking outlaws with a man whose past was a closed book. At the bridge, the evidence was stark. Though blurred by the melted snow, deep ruts were carved into the muddy approach, far deeper than any homesteader's buckboard would make. And in the mud, churned into the earth, were black, greasy stains of coal dust, just as she'd described. Ethan dismounted and knelt, running a gloved finger through the grime. He brought it to his nose and sniffed. "Ore wagon," he confirmed, his voice grim, heavily loaded. "Blackthorne isn't just grabbing land. He's moving product for his mine, likely off the official records." They spent the day following the faint trail, a path of bruised earth and occasional black smudges. It led them towards a sprawling, chaotic work camp teeming with railroad men, a rough collection of souls from every corner of the country, their faces hard, their bodies lean from punishing labor. The air smelled of sweat, cheap whiskey, and despair. A commotion from behind a line of dirty tents drew their attention. Two burly men, foremen by their dress, were accosting a much smaller, wiry man, his face already bloodied. "You saw nothing." "O'Connell," one of the brutes snarled, shoving the man against a stack of crates. "You keep your mouth shut about the night shipments, or the next thing you see will be the bottom of a ditch." "It ain't right." The man, O'Connell gasped, a defiant fire in his eyes despite the blood trickling from his lip, forging invoices, cheating the payroll. The foreman drew back his fist for another blow, but his arm was caught in a grip of iron. He spun around to find Ethan McCrae standing there, his face a cold, impassive mask. "I believe the man was finished speaking," Ethan said, his voice quiet but carrying a deadly weight. The two foremen were big men, used to settling disputes with their fists, but something in Ethan's eyes gave them pause. It was the unnerving stillness of a man who had seen true violence and was not impressed by its cheap imitations. They exchanged a nervous glance, mumbled a threat about O'Connell's job, and shuffled away into the crowd. Eliza rushed to the injured man's side, tearing a strip from her petticoat, an act of practicality that would have scandalized her former self. "Let me help you," she said softly, dabbing at the cut on his cheek. The man, Liam O'Connell, looked from her to Ethan, his expression a mixture of fear and gratitude. "They'll kill me for this," he whispered. "They'll have to get through me first," Ethan stated. He helped Liam to his feet. "You're a witness. I'm taking you back to my ranch. You'll be safe there." The ride back was a race against the dying light and the changing weather. A strange, yellowish haze began to obscure the horizon, and the wind picked up, carrying not the clean chill of winter but the gritty taste of dry earth. A dust storm was coming. It hit them on the open plains, a monstrous rolling wall of brown that swallowed the sky. The world devolved into a howling, choking chaos. Visibility dropped to near zero. The horses whinnied in terror, threatening to bolt. Ethan grabbed the bridle of Eliza's mare, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "This way, there's a rock outcropping I know." He led them into the maelstrom, Navigating by an instinct that Eliza couldn't fathom, they found shelter in a shallow overhang of rock, a meager shield against the storm's fury. They huddled together, Ethan, Eliza, and the wounded Liam, as the wind screamed past their refuge, flinging sand and pebbles against the stone. Night fell, but the storm showed no sign of abating. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket. Ethan built a small, sputtering fire from the dead wood he'd gathered, its flames a defiant flicker against the immense power of the storm. The temperature dropped, and the wind's howl was joined by a more sinister sound, the distant, hungry calls of a wolf pack, drawn by the scent of the horses. Survival stripped them down to their essentials. Eliza, using the last of the clean water from her canteen, finished cleaning Liam's wounds. She then set a battered coffee pot on the fire, brewing a pot of coffee so black and bitter it was more of a tonic than a comfort. They drank it from a single tin cup, passing it between them. The shared warmth, a small act of communion in the hostile darkness. Liam, exhausted and in pain, eventually drifted into a fitful sleep. Eliza and Ethan sat on opposite sides of the small fire, the silence between them filled by the storm and the wolves. "You're not afraid," Ethan observed, his voice a low rumble. "I am," Eliza admitted, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I'm terrified. For my father. For everything. But my father always said that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the acting in spite of it." She looked up, meeting his eyes across the fire. "You taught me how to shoot a gun. You didn't have to do that. Out here, a person needs to be able to stand on their own," he said, his gaze dropping to the cracked watch he'd pulled from his pocket, turning it over and over in his hands. "Relying on others can get them hurt." The words were heavy with unspoken history. They took turns on watch, while Eliza kept her vigil, the revolver resting in her lap. She watched Ethan sleep. For the first time, she saw the exhaustion etched on his face. The rigid control he maintained during the day was gone, replaced by a deep weariness. She saw the man, not the myth, the man who was risking everything for a cause that was not his own. A powerful, protective instinct rose in her, so fierce it startled her. When the storm finally broke at dawn, it left behind a world transformed, coated in a fine layer of red dust. They set out immediately, wanting to reach the safety of the ranch, but they were being hunted. As they navigated a narrow, rock-strewn canyon, the trap was sprung. 2 rifle shots echoed from the cliffs above, kicking up dust near the horses' hooves. The animals panicked, rearing and screaming. Liam cried out as his horse stumbled, nearly throwing him. From both ends of the canyon, riders appeared, the Copper Creek boys, their faces hidden by bandanas. Ethan reacted instantly. "Eliza, get Liam behind those boulders," he yelled, drawing his Colt. He shoved his horse forward, placing himself between them and the outlaws, firing 2 quick shots to drive them back. The canyon erupted in a cacophony of gunfire and ricocheting bullets. It was chaos. One of the outlaws, braver or more foolish than the rest, spurred his horse directly at Ethan, firing wildly. Ethan was forced to dive for cover behind an outcropping, momentarily pinned down as bullets chipped away at the rock just inches from his head. Eliza, her heart pounding in her throat, watched from the relative safety of the boulders. She saw the outlaw reload, taking aim at Ethan's exposed position. There was no time. All of Ethan's lessons flooded back to her in a single, crystalline moment. Focus on the sight. Squeeze. Don't pull. She raised the revolver, her hands surprisingly steady. She didn't aim for the man. She aimed for the rock face just above his head. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean. The bullet struck the cliff with a loud crack, sending a shower of rock fragments and dust down onto the outlaw and his horse. The horse screamed and reared violently, unseating its rider. The distraction was all Ethan needed. He burst from cover, firing with deadly accuracy. And the outlaws, their element of surprise lost and their leader unhorsed, broke and fled. Silence descended on the canyon, thick and ringing. Ethan walked over to where she stood, his face unreadable. He stopped in front of her, his presence overwhelming in the sudden quiet. He looked at the revolver still clutched in her hand, then met her eyes. "I trust you, Eliza," he said, his voice raw, "and not just because you saved my skin back there." He reached out, his fingers gently closing over hers on the gun, a current passing between them. "I trust you." It was a vow, an admission more profound than any declaration of affection. It was a bond forged in dust and gunfire, a partnership cemented in shared peril. They arrived back at the R late that afternoon, exhausted, bruised, but united. Doña Rosa met them on the porch, her face a mask of worry. She said nothing about their state, only pressed a sealed envelope into Ethan's hand. "A rider from town brought this," she said, her dark eyes troubled. "He said it was urgent, from Dr. Calloway." Ethan tore it open, his eyes scanning the neat, precise script. As he read, the color drained from his face, replaced by a cold, hard fury. He looked at Eliza, and she knew, with a sickening lurch in her stomach, that their victory had been short-lived. "What is it?" she whispered. He handed her the letter. Her eyes flew across the words. Deputy Crowley was arranging for her father to be transferred to the federal prison at Laramie, citing security concerns. "But Dr." May had underlined the last sentence, written with a desperate urgency. "My source in the sheriff's office says the route they're taking is remote, unused. Ethan, he's certain. They mean for him to get lost on the way." Lost, the word was a euphemism, a polite term for a murder disguised as an accident. They weren't just going to keep her father in jail. They were going to silence him for good. Part 4. Night on the Wooden Bridge. The world inside the R's ranch house shrank to the size of the kitchen table, where Dr. Calloway's letter lay like a death sentence. The oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, turning the familiar room into a cage of gathering darkness. For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic ticking of the mantel clock, each second a hammer blow against their dwindling time. Eliza's hands were clenched into fists in her lap, her knuckles white, the image of her father, alone and helpless, being led into a wilderness trap was afire in her mind. Vengeance was a bitter, tempting taste on her tongue, but beneath it was the cold, hard bedrock of terror. Ethan broke the silence. He folded the letter with a slow, deliberate motion, his face set like granite. The quiet, watchful man was gone, replaced by the army scout who saw the world as a map of threats and opportunities. "They'll move him tonight," he said, his voice a low, flat statement of fact. "A full moon is rising. They'll use the light. They'll take the old trapper's route that crosses Miller's Creek. The bridge there is narrow, isolated, a perfect place for an accident." A desperate plan began to form in his eyes, a dangerous spark in their winter sky depths. "We can't fight them in town. Crowley has too many men and the law on his side. But out there, the law is just the man with the steadiest hand." Eliza's voice was a whisper, but it was unwavering. "What are we going to do?" He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his gaze she saw not pity, but an assessment. He saw the girl who had survived the blizzard, the girl who had faced down an outlaw in a canyon. "We're going to intercept them," he said. "We're going to steal back an innocent man." The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. It relied on timing, deception, and the element of surprise. Tommy, who had been listening from the doorway with wide, frightened eyes, stepped forward. "I can help," he said, his young voice cracking with a mixture of fear and determination. "I can make a distraction. Set off some firecrackers behind the saloon, make it sound like a shootout. It'll draw some of the deputies away from the jail when they move Mr. Harper." Ethan initially refused. his face hardening at the thought of putting the boy in danger. But Tommy stood his ground. "You saved me from the orphanage." "Mr. McCrae, the Harpers, they're good people. Let me do this." Seeing the boy's resolve, Ethan finally relented with a curt nod, his expression pained. The riskiest part of the plan fell to Eliza. "Crowley will have at least 2 men with him in the prison wagon," Ethan explained. "I can handle them, but I need to get close. I need a reason for them to stop on that bridge." He looked at Eliza, the driver of the supply wagon that broke down on the trail this afternoon. "He's staying at the boarding house. He's about your height and build." Understanding dawned on her. "You want me to take his place?" The idea was terrifying. She would be the bait, but the thought of her father was stronger than any fear. "I'll do it." They worked quickly, their movements economical and fraught with urgency. Doña Rosa, her face a stoic mask of worry, found a set of the driver's spare clothes, a pair of rough canvas trousers, a flannel shirt, and a dusty, wide-brimmed hat. The clothes smelled of sweat and horse. As Eliza dressed, shedding the last vestiges of the preacher's daughter she once was, she felt a strange transformation. The unfamiliar weight of the trousers, the rough texture of the shirt. It was a costume for a role she never imagined playing, a role in a play where the stakes were life and death. As darkness fell, Tommy slipped away towards town, a small, brave shadow on a vital mission. Ethan and Eliza rode out under the rising moon, its cold, silver light illuminating a stark, black and white world. They tethered their horses in a dense thicket of pines a quarter-mile from the bridge and approached the rest of the way on foot. The Miller's Creek Bridge was a skeletal silhouette against the starry sky. It was an old, rickety structure, its wooden planks groaning under their own weight. Below, the creek was a ribbon of black ice, reflecting the moonlight in jagged shards. The wind howled through the canyon, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to pull the warmth from their very bones. It was a place that felt suspended between the living world and the dead. This was their stage. Eliza took her position, pulling the supply wagon, a small buckboard they'd borrowed from a deserted homestead, into the middle of the bridge. She'd loosened a wheel, just enough to make it wobble precariously, pulling the brim of her hat low to shadow her face. She began to work on the wheel, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Ethan melted into the deep shadows at the far end of the bridge, becoming one with the darkness. They waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The wind bit at Eliza's exposed skin, and the creaking of the bridge timbers played on her nerves. What if they don't come this way? What if Tommy was caught? Then she heard it, the rhythmic clop of hooves and the rumble of heavy wheels. A prison wagon, flanked by 2 outriders, was approaching, her breath caught in her throat. As the wagon drew closer, she could make out the figures. Deputy Jeb Crowley was driving, a lighted torch fixed to the wagon's frame casting his bloated face in a flickering, demonic glow. Her father, she knew, was locked in the cage on the back. Crowley reined in the horses as he reached the bridge. "What in blazes?" he bellowed, his voice thick with irritation. "Get this heap of junk off the road." Eliza kept her head down, her voice a rough mumble she hoped sounded masculine. "Busted wheel, mister. Just need a minute." Crowley grumbled an oath and climbed down from the driver's seat. He was arrogant, impatient, exactly as Ethan had predicted. He strode towards her, his boots thudding on the wooden planks. "I ain't got a minute. Move it, now!" As he reached the center of the bridge, a shadow detached itself from the darkness behind him. "That's far enough. Crowley!" Ethan's voice cut through the wind, cold and sharp as the ice below. Crowley spun around, his hand flying to the gun on his hip. The 2 outriders, startled, began to draw their own weapons. The night exploded. Ethan fired first, not at a man, but at the torch on Crowley's wagon. The torch shattered in a spray of sparks, plunging their end of the bridge into near darkness, illuminated only by the stark, unforgiving moonlight. The outriders fired blindly into the shadows. A bullet whined past Eliza's ear. Another struck a bridge post with a sickening thud. It was a short, brutal dance of shadows and light. Ethan moved with a lethal grace, firing twice more. One of the outriders cried out and tumbled from his horse. The other, seeing his odds, spurred his horse back the way he came, vanishing into the night. Crowley, using the chaos, fired wildly at the sound of Ethan's voice. A flash of pain, white-hot and sharp, seared across Ethan's side. He grunted, stumbling back a step. The bullet had only grazed him, a searing line of fire along his ribs, but it was enough to make him falter. Seeing Ethan hit, Crowley laughed, a cruel, triumphant sound. He turned his gun towards the shadows where Ethan had fallen. "Your turn, McCrae." This was her moment. All fear dissolved, replaced by a singular, clarifying purpose. Eliza launched herself from behind the buckboard, not towards safety, but towards the prison wagon. She scrambled onto the back, a skinning knife one Doña Rosa had pressed into her hand appearing in her grasp. Inside the cage, her father's face was a pale oval of disbelief. "Eliza," he gasped. "Hold still. Father." Crowley, hearing her, spun around, his eyes wide with shock as he recognized her. He raised his pistol. At that same instant, Ethan, fighting through the pain, rose from the shadows and fired. His bullet struck Crowley's gun hand. The pistol clattered to the wooden planks, and the deputy screamed, clutching his wrist. Eliza didn't hesitate. The gunfight was still echoing in her ears as she sawed at the thick ropes binding her father's hands through the bars of the cage. The fibers were tough, resistant. A stray bullet from one of the outriders had smashed the lock, leaving the ropes as the only way. Her fingers grew numb from the cold and the strain. The knife slipped, slicing her palm, but she barely felt it. Finally, with a last desperate pull, the final strand parted. "Now, Father," she urged. Ethan was already there, pulling the stunned deputy to his feet. "It's over. Crowley." They half-dragged, half-carried Nathan Harper off the bridge and into the relative safety of the pines where their horses waited. As they plunged into the forest, Crowley, cradling his wounded hand, hurled a final, venomous threat after them into the darkness. "You think you've won," he shrieked, his voice filled with spite. "It doesn't matter. Silas has the county judge in his pocket. The auction is tomorrow, by noon. The R, and every drop of its water will be his." The words were a parting shot, a poison that found its mark even in their victory, but there was no time to dwell on it. They rode hard for an hour, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the bridge. When they finally found a sheltered clearing deep within the forest, they stopped. The adrenaline faded, and reality crashed down upon them. Nathan Harper, weakened by his imprisonment and the frigid night, collapsed as he dismounted, a racking cough shaking his thin frame. Eliza knelt beside him, her heart sinking as she felt the feverish heat radiating from his skin. Ethan, clutching his side where blood was soaking through his shirt, looked at Eliza. The triumph of their escape was gone, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. They were fugitives, with a sick man and a powerful enemy who was about to steal everything from them. Eliza remembered the herbs Doña Rosa had insisted she pack, following the hastily scribbled instructions from Dr. May that Tommy had delivered with the firecrackers. She made a poultice of comfrey leaves for her father's chest and brewed a bitter tea from sage, as she tended to her father, whispering reassurances. She looked over at Ethan, who was grimly bandaging his own wound. They had crossed the bridge. They had chosen action over fear. But as the cold forest night closed in around them, Eliza knew that their longest, darkest night was only just beginning. Part V. Fire on the Prairie. The journey back to the R was a desperate, silent prayer. Nathan Harper, wrapped in every spare blanket they had, shivered uncontrollably in the saddle, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Every cough seemed to tear through his frail body. Eliza rode beside him, one hand steadying him, her face a mask of stoic resolve she did not feel. Ethan, his own face pale and tight with the pain from the graze along his ribs, scouted ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape, not for outlaws, but for the safest, quickest path home. The sanctuary of the ranch, once a place of refuge, now felt like a trap they were willingly walking back into. But the wilderness offered no comfort for a sick man. The ranch was their only chance. They arrived just after dawn, a trio of exhausted fugitives. Doña Rosa met them at the door, her dark eyes taking in the scene with a sad, knowing wisdom. There were no recriminations, no questions. She simply guided them inside, her calm presence a balm on their frayed nerves. Nathan was settled into the cot Eliza had once occupied, and Doña Rosa began applying cool cloths to his forehead, her hands moving with an ancient, practiced grace. The day passed in a haze of anxiety. Crowley's threat about the auction hung in the air, a poison with no antidote. It was to be held at noon in town, a public spectacle of their ruin. There was nothing they could do. They were trapped, their small victory at the bridge already turning to ash. Ethan, his wound cleaned and tightly bandaged by Doña Rosa, stood by the window, staring out at the vast expanse of his land. It was a clear, cold day, but a harsh wind had kicked up from the south, rattling the window panes and whipping the dry winter grass into a frenzy. It was Tommy who saw it first. The boy had been tending to the horses in the corral, his small frame a bundle of nervous energy. He came running into the house, his face white with alarm. "Mr. McCrae!" he shouted, pointing a trembling finger towards the southern range. Smoke. They all rushed to the window. On the far horizon, a plume of dark, greasy smoke was rising into the brilliant blue sky. It wasn't the smoke of a campfire. It was thick, angry, and growing. Ethan's body went rigid. "It's the south pasture," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Near the spring. He didn't need to explain. It was a classic, cruel tactic of the range. A grass fire, set to run with the wind, designed not to destroy the ranch outright, but to drive his cattle away from the water source, scattering them across the territory. It would make his land seem untamable, its most valuable asset, the ever-flowing spring, useless. It was Blackthorn's final move, a piece of theater to ensure no one would dare bid against him at the auction. "Doña Rosa, get the animals into the main corral. Soak every blanket and sack you can find," Ethan commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that belied his injury. He turned to Liam O'Connell, who had been quietly recovering in a corner. "Liam, you know how to use a spade." The railroad man nodded grimly. "Start digging a fire break on the north side of the creek bed. Tommy, you help him." He grabbed his hat and turned to Eliza. His eyes were blazing. "Stay here with your father." "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. She was already pulling on a pair of sturdy work gloves. "You're hurt. You can't do this alone. Tell me what to do." For a heartbeat, he looked as if he would argue, but he saw the steel in her eyes, the same resolve he'd seen in the canyon. He gave a single, sharp nod. The fire was moving faster than he had anticipated. A terrifying, galloping wall of orange and black, feeding on the dry grass the wind offered it. The roar was a living thing, a hungry beast devouring the prairie. The heat washed over them in waves, stealing the breath from their lungs. This was no longer a controlled burn. The wind, that fickle, unpredictable force of nature, had shifted. It was now blowing directly towards the heart of the ranch, towards the barns, the corrals, the house itself. Silas Blackthorn had unleashed a monster he couldn't control. The fight was primal, a desperate battle against an elemental force. Ethan, Eliza, Liam, and Tommy became a small, determined army. They worked with a frantic, focused energy, their world shrinking to the approaching line of fire. They dug, their spades striking sparks against the rocky soil, carving a raw, brown scar into the earth to starve the flames. They used the soaked sacks and blankets, beating at the smaller fires that jumped the line. The heavy, wet thud of the blows a rhythmic counterpoint to the fire's roar. Eliza had never known such exhaustion. Smoke filled her lungs, turning every breath into a painful, rasping ordeal. Her eyes streamed, and the heat was so intense it felt as if her skin was blistering. But she didn't stop. Beside her, Ethan worked like a man possessed, his face blackened with soot, his movements precise and efficient despite the dark stain of blood spreading on his bandage. He was everywhere at once, shouting instructions over the roar, his will the only thing holding their small defense together. From the edge of the property, they could see Ryder's townsfolk who had come out to watch the spectacle. They sat on their horses, silent and unmoving, their faces grim. They were too afraid of Blackthorn to help, yet they couldn't look away from the destruction of his greed. They were witnesses to a crime, but their silence made them accomplices. The fire reached the creek bed, the natural fire break Ethan had been counting on. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, the flames licking at the damp earth along the banks. But a powerful gust of wind sent a shower of embers arcing across the water, landing in a patch of dry brush near the main barn. The brush erupted in a geyser of flame. "The barn!" Ethan yelled, his voice cracking. They scrambled, a desperate last-ditch effort to save the heart of the ranch. The smoke was a thick, suffocating blanket now. It was impossible to see, impossible to breathe. Eliza felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She stumbled, catching herself on a fence post. Through the swirling blackness, she saw Ethan plunge into the smoke near the barn wall, beating at a patch of burning timber with a soaked blanket. Then he stopped. He swayed on his feet, the blanket falling from his grasp. He took one more step, then crumpled to the ground, a fallen giant swallowed by the smoke. "Ethan!" Her scream was a raw, animal sound of pure terror. All exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made the world sharp and clear. She ran, heedless of the flames that licked at the hem of her trousers. She plunged into the blinding smoke, her eyes burning, her lungs screaming for air. She found him lying motionless, frighteningly still. The fire was just feet away, a wall of heat and roaring sound. He was too heavy to lift. Panic clawed at her, cold and sharp. She couldn't leave him. She grabbed him under the arms, digging her heels into the scorched earth, and pulled. It was a nightmare of effort. She pulled with a strength she didn't know she possessed, her muscles screaming in protest. She moved him inch by agonizing inch, dragging him away from the encroaching flames, her own body shielding his from the worst of the heat. She was sobbing, coughing, her mind a singular, desperate chant. Not him. Please, not him. She finally dragged him clear of the immediate danger, collapsing beside him on a patch of blessedly unburnt ground. He was unconscious, his face gray beneath the soot. Was he breathing frantic? She pressed her ear to his chest, desperate to feel the rise and fall, to hear the beat of his heart. And she heard it, faint but steady, a slow, rhythmic thudding beneath her ear, thump, 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 the sound of his life. And in that moment, as she lay there, listening to the very core of his being, a profound and undeniable truth bloomed in her heart, silencing the fire, the fear, everything. In that moment of absolute terror, she realized her own heart was beating in perfect time with his, and that it had been for some time now, beating only for him. A cry from Tommy brought her back. The wind had shifted again. A sudden, miraculous change of direction was pushing the main body of the fire back on itself, back over the land it had already consumed. Their desperate firebreak at the creek, combined with the nature's whim, had saved them. The immediate danger was over. The aftermath was a scene of devastation. The sun rose on a blackened, smoking landscape. The south pasture was a wasteland of ash. The main barn was a charred, skeletal ruin. and several of the smaller outbuildings were gone completely. But the house still stood. The corral, though singed, was intact, and as the smoke cleared, Eliza could see it, shimmering in the morning light. Untouched by the flames, the spring, the heart of the land, was still flowing. They carried Ethan inside. He was alive, but his breathing was shallow, his body racked by the smoke he had inhaled. Eliza sat by his side, wiping the soot from his face with a damp cloth, refusing to leave him. They had won. But the cost was devastating. The ranch was crippled, and Crowley's words echoed in her mind. The auction was today. They had saved the land only to have it legally stolen from them. As she sat there, watching the slow rise and fall of Ethan's chest, Doña Rosa entered the room. The old woman's face was etched with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear. She held a long, cylindrical object wrapped in oilcloth. When Ethan's mother knew she was dying, Doña Rosa said, her voice soft, "She gave this to me. She told me to give it to her son on the day he needed it most." She placed the object in Eliza's hands. Eliza carefully unrolled the oilcloth. Inside was a hand-drawn map, yellowed with age, its ink faded but still clear. It was a detailed survey of the Triple R Ranch, but it showed something more, a complex network of lines and symbols, notations of depth and flow. It was a hydrographic map, detailing the underground aquifers and channels that fed the main spring. In the bottom corner, penned in a neat, elegant hand, was a date and a signature, embossed with a notary's seal from the territorial office, a seal that was clear and perfect. It was an official, registered claim to all water rights on the property. Originating from the spring, it was dated 1869. It predated the railroad. It predated the town of Copper Creek. It predated every single one of Silas Blackthorne's forged documents. Eliza stared at the map, her heart beginning to pound with a new, fierce hope. It wasn't a weapon of violence. It was a weapon of truth, in the ashes of their near destruction. A ghost from the past had just handed them the key to their future. Part 6. Judgment at Copper Creek, the Copper Creek Town Hall. A drafty, barn-like structure that smelled of sawdust and stale politics had never held a crowd like this. It was standing room only. On one side, clustered near the front, sat Silas Blackthorne, looking impeccable in a tailored suit, a confident smirk playing on his lips. Beside him was his lawyer, a man named Sterling, imported from Cheyenne, whose face was as smooth and polished as his expensive leather briefcase. They were flanked by the sullen, hulking presence of the Copper Creek boys, lining the back wall like vultures waiting for a carcass. On the other side sat a small, battered island of defiance. Ethan McCrae was there, his face still unnaturally pale beneath its weathered tan. A deep, racking cough occasionally shook his frame, a brutal reminder of the fire. Beside him, Eliza sat ramrod straight, her borrowed dress clean but plain, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her father, Nathan Harper, looking a decade older and impossibly frail, sat on her other side, his presence a quiet testament to the injustice that had started it all. Dr. May Calloway, Tommy Pike, and Liam O'Connell filled out their row, a mismatched collection of souls bound by a shared enemy. Presiding over the hearing was County Judge Miller, a man whose portly belly and florid face spoke of a life of indulgence. He viewed the proceedings with an air of bored impatience, his gavel tapping rhythmically, a clear signal that he considered this a mere formality before rubber-stamping Blackthorne's claims. Sterling, Blackthorne's lawyer, rose to speak, his voice a smooth, condescending balm that slid over the tense crowd. He didn't begin with legal arguments or property claims. He began by attacking Eliza. "Before we examine the so-called disputes over these foreclosed properties," he began, turning to gesture at Eliza, "we must first consider the source of these wild accusations. We have a young woman, Miss Eliza Harper, A newcomer of no means, her father, a preacher of questionable associations, is arrested on a serious charge. And what happens next? This destitute girl finds herself, almost miraculously, under the protection of the wealthiest, most reclusive rancher in this territory. He let the words hang in the air, thick with insinuation. One must ask, what is the nature of this protection? What promises were made? What desperation might lead a young woman to fabricate a story? A grand conspiracy. In order to secure her position and save her father from the consequences of his actions. A low, ugly murmur rippled through the crowd. Eliza felt her cheeks burn with a hot, furious shame. She was being painted as a harlot, a liar, a manipulator. She felt Ethan tense beside her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the judge. This was a battle to be fought with words, not fists. When it was their turn, their lawyer, an earnest, no-nonsense man from the next county named Davies, began to dismantle Sterling's narrative piece by piece. He called Dr. May Calloway to the stand first. May's testimony was crisp and professional. She confirmed she had treated Eliza's injuries after the blizzard, validating her harrowing journey. She testified to Nathan Harper's declining health in the jail, a condition exacerbated by neglect, in my medical opinion, May stated, her gaze unwavering as she looked at Judge Miller. The plan to transport Preacher Harper to Laramie in his condition, via a remote trail in the dead of winter, was not a standard security procedure. It was a medical death sentence. Next came Liam O'Connell. The railroad worker was visibly terrified, his eyes darting towards Blackthorn. But he spoke his truth. He told the court about the systematic fraud, the forged payrolls and shipping invoices for the mine. The men who threatened me, Liam said, his voice gaining strength. They worked for Mr. Blackthorn. They told me to keep quiet about the night shipments, the same shipments made with heavy ore wagons. Davies then called Eliza as she walked to the stand. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. Sterling's words echoed in her ears. She took a deep breath and looked not at the hostile crowd, but at her father, who gave her a faint, encouraging nod. She told her story simply, without embellishment. She described arriving in the blizzard, the exhaustion, the fear. Then she described the scene in the alley. I saw Mr. Blackthorn give Deputy Crowley a leather pouch. She said, her voice clear and steady. It was heavy. When the deputy fumbled it, I saw that it was stained with a black dust, like coal. Sterling leaped to his feet. Objection. The fanciful imaginings of a frightened girl. It is not imagination, Eliza said, her voice rising with a passion she didn't know she had. It was the same dust we found at the old bridge. Where the ore wagons crossed, it was the proof that the law and the railroad were working together. Finally. Davies called his most unlikely witness, Tommy Pike. The boy walked to the stand, his small stature seeming to shrink even further under the scrutiny of the room. But when he spoke, his voice was clear. He described the fire. He told them how he had seen two of the Copper Creek boys riding away from the south pasture just moments before he saw the smoke. They said it. Judge, Tommy said, pointing a small, grubby finger at the back of the room. I saw 'em. They set it to burn, Mr. McCrae, out before the auction. The testimony was a tapestry of truth, each thread woven together to create a picture of corruption so blatant it was impossible to ignore. Davies laid the forged foreclosure notice on the judge's bench next to an official deed from Ethan's files. Your Honor, as you can see, the county seal has been crudely duplicated. This is not a legal document. It is a fraud. Judge Miller glanced at the papers with performative disinterest. He leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face. He had listened to their stories, their evidence, and he was unmoved. His loyalties had been bought and paid for long ago. This is all very compelling theater, the judge said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Hearsay from a disgruntled employee, the ramblings of a child, and the desperate claims of a fugitive's daughter. What I have before me are notarized documents, claiming this land for unpaid taxes. Unless you have something more, Mr. Davies, something that carries the actual weight of the law, I am prepared to rule." The room fell silent. Blackthorne smiled. This was the moment of his victory. Davies returned the smile, a thin, cold expression. "As a matter of fact, Your Honor, we do. We have one final piece of evidence to submit. Evidence that speaks not only to the ownership of the Triple R Ranch, but to the very foundation of every land claim in this valley." He walked back to his table and picked up the oilcloth-wrapped cylinder. All eyes were on him as he slowly unrolled it on the bench in front of the judge. The ancient, hand-drawn map, with its faded ink and delicate script, seemed to quiet the entire room. "What is this relic?" Judge Miller scoffed. "This, Your Honor, is the original 1869 hydrographic survey and water rights claim for the McCrae homestead," Davies announced, his voice ringing with authority. "It details the spring, the creeks, and the underground aquifers that feed them. It grants the McCrae family and their descendants exclusive and permanent rights to all water originating on their property. It was filed with and notarized by the United States Territorial Office 15 years ago." He let that sink in before delivering the final, fatal blow. He pointed to the embossed seal at the bottom of the map. "This seal, Your Honor, is a legitimate federal notary seal from 1869. As an expert in legal documents, I am sure you will appreciate its authenticity. I would invite you to compare it to the county seal on Mr. Blackthorne's foreclosure notice. One is a symbol of federal law and established rights. The other," he paused, letting his gaze sweep over Blackthorne and his lawyer, "is evidence of a federal crime." The trap had been sprung. The color drained from Judge Miller's face. This changed everything. This was no longer a local dispute he could squash with his bought and paid for authority. The water rights map was a federal document. To ignore it, to rule against it, would be to invite the scrutiny of federal marshals. To acknowledge it would be to invalidate Blackthorne's entire land grab scheme, which was predicated on controlling the valley's water. Worse, it would prove that he, the judge, had knowingly accepted fraudulent documents bearing a forged seal. He was implicated. He was trapped. A low murmur grew into a roar as the townsfolk in the audience, who had been cowed into silence, finally understood. This wasn't about one ranch. This was about the theft of their future, all based on a lie. Judge Miller began to sweat profusely, his eyes darting frantically between the map and Blackthorne's suddenly grim face. He slammed his gavel down, again and again. "Order, order," he shouted, his voice cracking. This new evidence requires further review. This hearing is adjourned pending a full investigation." It was a desperate attempt to regain control. But it was too late. The dam of fear had broken. In the ensuing chaos, as people began shouting and pointing, Silas Blackthorne's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of cold fury. He caught the eye of the lead outlaw at the back of the room and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. While the judge scurried from the room and Davies was surrounded by jubilant townsfolk, Blackthorne and his lawyer slipped through a side door. By the time anyone realized they were gone, the sound of hoofbeats was already fading down the main street. Silas Blackthorne and the Copper Creek boys had fled. Amidst the chaos, Ethan, Eliza, her father, and their small band of allies stood together. They had won. They had brought the truth into the light. But as the sound of the escaping horses faded into the distance, a cold realization settled over them. They had won the battle in the courtroom, but the real enemy was now a fugitive, unbound by any law, and somewhere out there in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, he was planning his revenge. Part 7. Dragon's Maw Canyon. The victory in the courtroom was a fleeting, fragile thing. As the townsfolk celebrated their reclaimed futures, a harder truth settled over Ethan, and Eliza justice hadn't been served. It had simply been postponed. A federal marshal, A grim-faced man named Abernathy, who had arrived on the afternoon train to investigate the fraudulent claims, was now the official law in Copper Creek. He began deputizing a posse, but Silas Blackthorne and his men had a significant head start. Ethan, leaning heavily against a pillar on the town hall porch, watched them saddle up. His body was a symphony of pain. The bullet graze on his side was a hot, angry line, and every breath was a battle against the lingering fire in his lungs. Abernathy took one look at him and shook his head. "You're in no shape to ride. McCrae, you've done your part." "They're heading for the Badlands," Ethan rasped, his voice rough. "They know every trail. You'll lose them." "Then we'll pick up their trail when we can," Abernathy replied, his tone final. It was Eliza who stepped forward, the oilcloth map clutched in her hand. "No, you won't," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the assembled men. She looked directly at the marshal. "I know the way they're going. They'll follow the old ore wagon route towards Dragon's Maw Canyon. It's the only path that can hide a dozen riders and still lead them north." Abernathy raised a skeptical eyebrow. "And how would you know that, Miss?" "Because I followed it before," she said, a quiet fire in her eyes. "I remember the signs, the coal dust stains on the rocks. They'll be there. But the spring rains have started. By morning, the creek will be a torrent, and the trail will be washed away. You have to go now, and I have to go with you." The posse men murmured amongst themselves, shocked at her audacity, but Ethan saw the unwavering certainty in her face. He pushed himself off the pillar, his jaw set. "She's right, she's our guide, and if she rides, I ride." The pursuit was a desperate chase through a dying world. They rode into a landscape of stunning, brutal beauty, a maze of towering red rock formations that clawed at a sky bruised with the colors of an approaching storm. A steady, chilling spring rain began to fall, turning the dusty trail into a slick, treacherous ribbon of red mud. The horses slipped and struggled, their breaths pluming in the cold air. Eliza rode at the head of the posse alongside Ethan and Marshal Abernathy. She proved to be an unnervingly good guide. She saw things the other men missed: a black smudge on the underside of a ledge, sheltered from the rain, a deep wagon rut that hadn't yet dissolved into the mud. She was no longer just following a trail. She was thinking like her enemy, anticipating his moves. As they pushed deeper into the canyon, the terrain grew more hostile. The narrow path clung to the side of a cliff, with a sheer drop to the creek below, which was now a roaring, muddy flood. The steady rain loosened the rock, and small pebbles skittered down the canyon walls, a constant, nerve-wracking reminder of the danger of a larger rock slide. They found the outlaws' abandoned ore wagon, one of its wheels shattered in a deep washout. Blackthorne had been forced to abandon his heavier supplies, pushing on with only what their horses could carry. They were getting closer. The confrontation, when it came, was not a single, explosive battle, but a grueling war of attrition. Blackthorne's men, skilled in guerrilla tactics, used the canyon to their advantage. A sniper's shot would ring out from the cliffs above, forcing the posse to take cover. They would dislodge rocks, sending them crashing down onto the trail ahead. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse. Ethan, though weakened, was a master of this game. He directed the posse with quiet, efficient commands, using his scout's eye to spot potential ambush points. But the physical toll was mounting. A violent coughing fit would seize him after every strenuous climb, leaving him breathless and dizzy. The old scars on his back, remnants of a long-ago war, began to ache with a deep, phantom pain in the damp cold. He was fighting a war on two fronts, one against Blackthorne, the other against his own body. Eliza watched him, her heart aching with a helpless fear. She saw him falter after dislodging a boulder to block a sniper's line of sight. She was at his side in an instant, a canteen in her hand. "You have to rest," she pleaded. He shook his head, leaning against the wet rock, his breathing labored. "Can't Not yet. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a grim determination, and something more, a deep, weary gratitude. You've changed. Eliza Harper, you're a fighter. You taught me how, she whispered. The final confrontation took place on a high, narrow precipice known as the Dragon's Teeth, where the canyon walls squeezed the trail to just a few feet wide. A sudden, violent rock slide, triggered by Blackthorn's rearguard, had cut off the main body of the posse, leaving only Ethan and Eliza to face the fugitives. Below them, the floodwaters churned, a hungry, brown beast. Silas Blackthorn stood on the far side of the gap, his fine suit in tatters, his face a mask of feral desperation. Most of his men had been captured or had fled. Only 2 remained by his side. "It's over! Blackthorn!" Ethan yelled, his voice raw. "There's nowhere left to run!" Blackthorn laughed, a ragged, unhinged sound that echoed off the wet canyon walls. "It's never over. McCrae, this land was meant to be mine." He and his men opened fire, their shots wild and desperate. Ethan pushed Eliza behind a rock, returning fire with a steady, lethal calm. One of Blackthorn's men cried out and fell. The other lost his nerve and scrambled away, trying to climb the cliff face to escape. Now it was just Blackthorn. He fired his last shot, the bullet striking the rock near Ethan's head. He threw the empty pistol down in disgust. Ethan rose, his own weapon leveled, his aim true. But Eliza put a hand on his arm. "No," she said softly. "Let the law have him." As she stepped out from behind the rock, her face streaked with mud and rain, Silas Blackthorn stared at her. He saw not the frightened girl from the alley, but the woman who had undone him. With a snarl of pure hatred, he lunged, not at Ethan but at her. But his feet, clad in slick city shoes, betrayed him. He slipped on the wet, treacherous rock at the very edge of the precipice. He cried out, a sound of shock and fear, as he teetered on the brink, his arms flailing for purchase. For a heartbeat, Eliza saw only a man about to die, the preacher's daughter in her. The part of her that believed in grace and redemption reacted instinctively. She lunged forward and offered him her hand. "Take my hand." Their fingers brushed. For a second, a look of disbelief flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar, venomous greed. He latched onto her arm, not to save himself, but to pull her with him. His weight was an anchor, dragging her towards the abyss. She screamed as she felt herself being pulled forward, her boots sliding on the slick rock. But before she could go over the edge, a powerful arm wrapped around her waist. Ethan was there. He threw his entire body back, his boots digging into the mud, his muscles straining with a final, desperate surge of strength. The force of his pull broke Blackthorn's grip. Silas stared at them for one long, silent moment, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Then, with a cry that was swallowed by the roar of the flood, he was gone. He fell into the churning, violent water below and was swept away, a victim not of a bullet, but of his own grasping, destructive nature. The aftermath was a blur. Marshal Abernathy and the posse finally cleared the rock slide and took the remaining outlaws, including a whimpering Jeb Crowley, into custody. But the fight was over for Ethan. The last of his strength was gone. A violent fever, born of his wounds and exhaustion, took hold. He swayed on his feet, his face ashen, and collapsed into Eliza's arms. They found shelter in a place that time had forgotten, a tiny, abandoned miner's cabin tucked into a sheltered cove, missed by the posse in their rush. It was little more than a one-room hovel, but it was dry, and a small stone fireplace offered the promise of warmth. Eliza, with Abernathy's help, got Ethan inside and onto a crude rope bed. The marshal promised to send Dr. May as soon as he got back to town. Then she was alone with him, in the heart of the wilderness, with the rain drumming a soft tattoo on the sod roof. For 2 days, she fought for his life. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his body burning with fever. muttering names and places from a past she didn't know. She bathed his face with cool water from the creek. She brewed teas from the herbs Doña Rosa had taught her to recognize. She sat by his side, her hand resting on his forehead. A silent, ceaseless vigil. On the second night, as the fever seemed to peak, she feared she was losing him. In the flickering firelight, she took out the small, worn Bible her father had given her and began to read aloud, her voice a soft, steady murmur against the storm outside. She read the Psalms, the words of comfort and strength, a prayer for them both. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, his gaze lucid for the first time in days. He was weak, but the fire of the fever had receded from his eyes. He reached out a hand, his fingers barely brushing hers. She leaned closer, her heart full of a feeling so vast it left no room for words. She thought of the fire, of listening to his heart, of the terrifying, clarifying moment on the cliff. She bent down, her lips close to his ear, and whispered the truth that had become the very center of her world. "My heart," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "It beats only for you." He couldn't speak, but his fingers tightened on hers, a faint but definite pressure, a promise. In that small, firelit cabin, surrounded by the wildness of a world they had fought so hard to save, they sealed their future. The trials were over. The real one in the courtroom to come would be a formality. Their own trial, by fire and water, had ended here. Part 2. New grass and a small bell. Summer came to the high plains of Wyoming like a long, slow exhalation of relief. The sun, a benevolent gold in a vast blue sky, coaxed new life from the fire-blackened earth. Tiny shoots of green grass, tenacious and determined, pushed their way through the ash, a verdant promise that life, however brutalized, would always find a way to return. The formal trial in Cheyenne was less a battle and more a final tallying of accounts, with Silas Blackthorn gone, claimed by the very canyon he had used as a weapon. His empire of fear crumbled. Liam O'Connell's testimony, corroborated by a cache of forged documents discovered in Blackthorn's office, was irrefutable. Judge Miller, stripped of his robes and his dignity, was sentenced to a federal penitentiary for corruption. Deputy Crowley and the handful of captured Copper Creek boys were found guilty of a litany of crimes, from armed robbery to attempted murder, their futures now confined to the grim, stone walls of a territorial prison. The rule of law, which had seemed so distant and fragile, had finally asserted itself, not with the crack of a gunshot, but with the quiet, inexorable weight of truth. The Triple R Ranch, its ownership secured and its water rights reaffirmed, began to heal. The charred skeleton of the barn was torn down, and the air filled with the clean, sharp scent of freshly cut timber as a new one was raised in its place. The townsfolk, who had once stood by as silent witnesses, now came forward. They came with hammers and saws, with pots of stew and loaves of bread, their collective guilt transformed into a communal effort of rebuilding. They were no longer a town of fearful individuals, but a community forged in the ashes of a shared ordeal. Ethan, his body finally mended, was a changed man. The haunted, solitary rancher who kept the world at arm's length was gone. He still possessed a deep, quiet stillness, but it was no longer the stillness of a fortress. It was the calm of a deep harbor, the ghosts of his past. The family he had failed to protect long ago had not vanished, but he no longer allowed them to command his future. He had opened his gates, not just to Eliza, but to the world. His greatest project that summer was not the new barn, but a simple irrigation ditch. It started at the shimmering spring, the heart of his land, and snaked its way for over a mile to the edge of his property, where the smaller homesteads of his neighbors struggled against the dry soil, one by one. He met with the families who had once viewed him with suspicion, the very people Blackthorn had sought to displace. He offered them access to his water, not for a price, but as a neighbor. It was a revolutionary act in a land where water was more precious than gold. He was breaking the cycle of greed, sharing the lifeblood of the valley and, in doing so, dismantling the bitter legacy of the greedy land baron. Eliza, too, had found her purpose, not as a silent partner in Ethan's life, but as a force of her own. The shy, dutiful preacher's daughter had been tempered in blizzard and fire, and from that crucible had emerged a woman of quiet strength and unshakable resolve. She saw the true poverty of Copper Creek was not just a lack of money, but a lack of knowledge, a lack of hope for the next generation. With funds from a community trust established with the sale of Blackthorn's seized assets, she started a school. It was a simple, one-room structure, built of pine and hope. Situated on a small plot of land Ethan deeded to the town, right next to his own property line, the children of ranchers and railroad men, children who had never held a book, now sat at rough-hewn desks, their faces alight with curiosity. Eliza was their teacher. She taught them their letters and their numbers, but she also taught them the lessons she had learned: that courage was not the absence of fear, that justice required a voice, and that a community was only as strong as the hands it was willing to extend to its neighbors. Her father, Nathan Harper, his health slowly returning in the dry summer air, would often sit at the back of the schoolhouse, a quiet, proud observer. He no longer preached from a pulpit, but he saw a greater sermon being delivered in his daughter's patient lessons and in the shared water that flowed through Ethan's ditch. The love between Ethan and Eliza was like the summer landscape itself, vast, quiet, and deeply rooted. It wasn't a love of grand declarations or fiery passions, but of shared silence on the porch as the sun set, of a comforting hand on the shoulder after a long day, of the complete and total trust they had forged in the heart of chaos. One evening, as they stood watching the last rays of light paint the mountains in hues of purple and rose, he took the old, cracked pocket watch from his vest. He had carried it for years, a broken relic of a broken past. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, without a word, he tossed it into the deep, clear water of the spring. They watched it sink, a flash of silver disappearing into the blue depths, a final release of the ghosts that had held him captive. He turned to her, his winter sky eyes clear and full of a light she had never seen before, and simply said, "Marry me, Eliza." Her yes was as soft and sure as the evening breeze. Their wedding, at the end of the summer, was not an event for the town, but a quiet gathering for their chosen family. They stood beneath a simple wooden trellis Doña Rosa had built, which was now covered in a riot of wild clematis and prairie roses she had carefully transplanted. The scent of wildflowers mingled with the smell of new grass on the warm air. Nathan Harper, his voice once again steady and clear, officiated the ceremony, his words speaking not of scripture and sin, but of resilience, grace, and the redemptive power of love. Dr. May was there, her usually stern face softened by a genuine smile. Liam O'Connell, now the foreman of an honest railroad crew, stood beaming. Instead of a traditional hymn, Tommy Pike, dressed in a new shirt and looking impossibly grown up, stood before the small gathering. He held a worn copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass that Eliza had given him. He was nervous, but he read with a clear, proud voice. "This is the grass that grows wherever the land is and the water is. This is the common air that bathes the globe." As he finished, Doña Rosa, who stood beside the couple as their witness, reached into her apron pocket. She produced a small, silver bell, the kind used to call ranch hands to a meal. She rang it once, a single, clear note that shimmered in the quiet air. It was not a loud, formal peal from a church tower, but a small, intimate sound. It was the sound of hope, the sound of a new beginning, the sound of home. Ethan, his large, calloused hand gently holding Eliza's, leaned down and kissed his bride. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a silent promise of shared dawns and quiet evenings, of hardships faced together and joys multiplied. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, they stood alone, watching their guests depart. The wind, a constant presence on the prairie, rustled through the new leaves of the cottonwood trees. In the distance, they could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of horses' hooves, a reminder that the world moved on, that the West was still a wild and untamed place. But here, in this small pocket of the world they had fought for and rebuilt, they had found their peace. They had taken a land of dust and fear and, together, had made it a place of new grass and love. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please comment below and let us know where you're listening from in the world. We'd love to connect and share our thoughts. And if you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Night, giving this video a like, and supporting us further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.